artist from Finland, and in this video I create this watercolor card which is abstract flowers. And I create this without any photo or anything, just freely, and talk at the same time about creating freely, painting freely, which is my passion, and of course about painting flowers, which is also my passion. These cards are fun to create, and I think that when you can give something created in watercolor as a gift, it's just precious. This card is only one-sided, but you can create greeting cards like this, which are folded, so you can decide. I always start my cards so that I add masking tape around the card so that it has a white frame. I think it looks really good on cards, and it also makes the painting a bit easier when you have the tape holding the painting in place. I start painting with a big brush. It can be flat or round, it doesn't matter, but I want to loosen up. And I use quite watery paint because I think that watercolors and water belong together, of course, but also because water makes the painting much looser. When I work on the card, I try to sharpen the image. So first, it's just a blurry thing that I'm creating. And then later, the picture will get sharpened. So start with a very big brush and be bold. And when you use watery paint, you have nothing to worry about. You are just warming up at this point. It doesn't matter what colors you choose. You can choose whatever you feel drawn to or what you like. It's just about loosening up. This is special in watercolor painting, that you start with white and then you slowly darken the painting. And this way it's like other way around than what you might use to paint. So often first, if you think about acrylics for example, often first you add shadows and you add darkness and then you add the brights in the middle. But in watercolors you have to, save the whites and pale colors and then add dark colors step by step. It's also important to dry the layers, and once you have been really loose and abstract, it's good to let the card dry before changing the brush and starting a new layer. That is sometimes an agony. It can be really frustrating to wait for the paint to dry. But I think this is something where you can use your time well, so that maybe before you even do the serious start, the actual start, you do the warming up much earlier. So if you have some cooking to do, or if you have something taking the dogs out, whatever we have, everyday activities, maybe you want to start with the warming up layer and then take the dogs out and then come back when the card has dried. Because the first layer is not really important. The idea of the first layer is just to get those beautiful pastel tones that make every card. Even if I said in the beginning that you can use whatever colors you want, you might want to narrow down something. For example, exclude one color. For example, you don't use any yellows or you don't use any blues or things like that. I use every primary color and every secondary color, so I don't have that. But I do limit my brushes. So I picked 4 brushes that I'm going to use, and then I add more brushes if I need. So I start with 4 brushes. One of them is big and flat brush. Then the second of them is what I call chatty brush. It's quite small, quite thin, but it it's not good for accurate work. It's not like this brush has a kind of engineer's soul doing all the accurate things, sharp things. But this brush is kind of, loose, relaxed, and very chatty. So it's fun to have some conversations with this brush. Then I also have a couple of thin brushes that are quite accurate. And the blue one is pretty accurate and quite universal for this card. You can use it with quite a lot of water, and then you can use it for accurate work. But then I have this rigger brush, which has very long and thin hair, and it's very good for thin strokes. And you don't necessarily have to have these brushes, but I suggest that you have a variety of brushes. Even if you would limit your brushes, see that every brush is a bit different, and not only different in thickness or such, but different in nature, so that you have these engineering-like brushes that are very accurate, and then these chatty, more relaxed brushes that are fun to play with. You don't have to have a rigger brush. You can use any brush for thin lines almost. Even flat brushes can be used for thin lines if you just turn the brush. But I would suggest you have one brush dedicated for thin lines. And now you may ask, why thin lines? Because, the card doesn't look sharp if you only have blurry areas. And then one thing with flowers and plants. They have all kinds of very delicate things, very delicate subtle veins, delicate ornamental stems and things like that. So when you want to express the delicacy of the flowers, then thin lines are good. Then when you add a new layer with the chatty brush, you can hold the brush very differently. You can hold it further up and more loosely. And you can just let the brush do all the chatting. Change colors, add new details, and don't think about flowers or anything concrete. Just enjoy colors. Just enjoy chatting with your brush. When you're painting freely, you can be innovative in what order you use the brushes. So yeah, I said that we start with the thick brush, but you don't have to work from big brush to thinner brushes. That's the traditional way, to start with the thick brush and then work towards the thinner ones. You can introduce the thin brush much earlier. And this is like you are creating support. When you're painting freely, you need support. You need some kind of confidence. I always try to find new methods where I feel more secure in the beginning. Because every time I start painting in this way, it's still quite exciting, quite adventurous, and I often have insecurities. It's just natural. When you don't know what you are creating, when you are creating freely, it's natural to have this fear. This fear is also something that might prevent you from creating freely, that might prevent you from starting working towards your dreams. And I think it's important to invent all kinds of routines or all kinds of support that you can. And here I suggest that you try this technique to add thin lines with quite watery paint so that it is not full of color, full of pigment, but so that it creates only subtle sort of net, not symmetrical net, but asymmetrical random net on the painting. And this way you get suggestions for veins, stems, and all kinds of very plant and flower related stuff. Namely, when you want to paint abstract flowers, there are these two things, abstract and flowers. And abstract means you have to invent a language that is based on shapes and colors. And flowers means that the language have to be flowery. So flowers are very decorative. A language of flowers is quite ornamental, and it's also very organic. So with the rigger brush or with any thin brush, when you draw these thin lines loosely, you get this kind of organic and ornamental language there on paper. The word abstract might feel intimidating, and then flowers might feel too traditional. But don't fall into that. You can create anything with flowers. I'm really into flowers. And I believe that flowers are like the seed of art. And when you're thinking about this fearful thing, that you have this fear, that you don't know what you are creating, it can be kind of consolation that there will be some kind of flowers there, some kind of flowers. But it's also good to remember that there are so many different kind of flowers, and you can invent even more than what nature has invented. Flowers are not just something that has round center and then some round petals, 5 or 7 petals, as they say. It's not just that. Forget this stereotype. Flowers are 3-dimensional animals, humans even. Every shape of their petal is some kind of gesture, and their center is like face. So this is the stage where you want to let go of plants, flowers, everything stereotypical, and you want to enjoy every fun shape that has appeared on the paper, just accidentally. When you have those thin lines, then maybe you already start to see flowers. We humans easily see flowers. We easily see faces. We easily see all kinds of things. It's good to slow down now a bit. Painting intuitively like this is just like you sow a meadow. The first plants are not those that end up in the final version necessarily. So be open there. Be open that when you find a flower, it can get larger or smaller when you continue the process. Next, we will use 2 techniques. Positive painting, so painting the actual details of the flowers, and negative painting, so painting the background. And if you remember what I said in the beginning, that we want to save the blank and pale parts and let the paper white to be our white. So that's when it's important that you also paint the background, not only the actual flowers. So you can outline and paint around the shape instead of painting the actual shape. Let those pastel colors be the centerpieces in the painting. When you paint with thin brush and fairly small amount of water, your image becomes sharper and sharper, and it's very rewarding, very rewarding. But at the same time, you lose some of the looseness. And I like to add some water once in a while so that I maintain this watery feel too, that everything is not sharp, and that part of the card is also blurry. Now it's also good to think about how dark you want your painting to be. Here's one that is fairly dark, that has fairly dark colors. You can add a new layer after a layer, and you can work with the painting for a long time. And you can also use very thick paint. When you want to have a paler painting, then it's important that your layers are very watery, very thin, not much pigment. As you can see from my pale painting, there are always darker parts to create the sense of depth. It's also always important to use thick paint, but how much? That's the question. I love the botanical feel, so in this card I worked quite a long time. And I made the background quite dark, so it feels like you are deep in the bush admiring the flowers. And I love this kind of botanical feel. I think I'm a kind of rebel botanical artist because I don't use photos, but I do have a garden and I love flowers. So yes, I found my way in this kind of loose botanical feel. When I have been painting for a while, I always question where the actual flowers are and how big they are. At this point, you can still make a flower larger just by including some of the leaves that you've painted or some of the blurry areas that are close by. You can make the flower larger that way. And it's also easy to reduce the size of flower just by adding more background. In general, when I talk about background, I mean that you can use different colors in the background. It's really boring if you only use one color in the background. So you can use many colors in the background. It makes the flower card lively, and that's part of its abstract feel, that the color of the background changes. And now when I question the outlines of the flowers and I adjust the outlines, I realize that I want to have one more brush. I want to have this thinner brush than my blue brush is. And this is great for details. And we're painting quite small. So of course, if you're painting a bigger painting, then you need less these small brushes. The smaller the painting area is, the smaller brushes you need. Every project has some kind of problem. There's always a flower that is not behaving. That started maybe beautiful, but then changed, and you made some bad decisions, or just ended up in the situation where you have some parts that you want to change. You can always wipe off paint if your paper is thick enough. So often using a thick paper and painting fewer projects, painting for a longer time and fewer pieces, combined with the better quality paper, is a better solution to develop your skills as watercolor artists than to use thin and bad quality paper that can't handle any wiping off, and then you always have to toss away and start a new one, and you always come to this point where you have these problems. And don't worry about this. Don't let this win. Don't give up. Just keep painting. There's always something that looks problematic, but then when you have many flowers, you can always raise a flower, make a flower that is much more beautiful, a bit more visible, and it actually just adds to the atmosphere that every flower is not in the front. Now when you have leaves and flowers, it's difficult to maintain the abstract idea. The abstract means that your painting looks great as shapes and lines. You should look at it so that it's just a composition, not a flower painting at all. And that's often difficult. I use this method. I take the tape off and I turn the card upside down. And this way I don't look so much at what every shape represents, but I look at the painting like it's a puzzle. So this helps. And of course it's a bit risky when the masking tape is off not to make a mess on the white borders, but you can put the masking tape on there too, and I use that if I get very near the edge. Language of flowers is more like languages of flowers, because you can create abstract flowers in very different styles. Even my style is not always just one particular style. For example, this piece is quite different than the card I'm painting in this video. There are more blurry details and such. So you can change how much you use every word. If you think about shape as a word, you can change how much you use that shape. You can change how much you use different kind of lines. It's not that you only have to create like I do. You can use plenty of one thing and then very little of something. When you start adding different kind of shapes to your regular selection, creating freely is not that intimidating. And what happens? You can also paint other things than flowers. You can also use not so flowery language. It's easy to change flowery shapes to more geometric shapes, for example. You can enlarge your visual language and you can paint almost anything. I love to create watercolor paintings for one particular reason, and especially flower paintings. There's something really heartwarming in this idea of gift giving, and I've always wanted to be an artist that is not only related to interior decorating, home decor and things like that. I've always wanted to be a painter who also can paint gifts, and I've also always wanted to be a painter who helps other people to give gifts to. And that's part of the reason I've made this video, and part of the reason I've made my newest course, A Wild Garden. I have often hidden a smile when I hear someone say that their garden is now finished. A garden is like a person, constantly changing and never finished. A garden can start with a few plants and a controlled plan, but nature always makes it wilder. We humans have the same inner wildness that makes everything feel messy, but without which life is not enjoyable anymore. We need that mess. The longer I've been an artist, the more I've begun to strive for that wildness in my art. That when I paint, I'm not only creating, but also seeing and receiving something that I can't fully control. This not only makes the process more relaxing, but also reveals opportunities to break the boundaries of the flower painting tradition.
All gardeners know that it's important to prune and weed. You have to create space and light for the most sensitive seedlings.
The same is true in art. A timid spot among the bravest splashes can begin a process that takes the painting to a new level. And when you bring in clarity, even the wildest gardens will look peaceful. For a flower painter, flowers have a face and a personality, just like a person has. That's why I don't think flowers only want photographic portraits. I believe flowers love expressive art. In this course, we will examine real flowers, but we won't paint them directly from photos. We will let our art grow like a wild garden, naturally and diversely. With the projects in the course, you will learn beyond the obvious ways and find more interesting paths to expressive flower painting.